Let me tell you what keeps me up at night about this crisis, because it is not the thing most people lead with. It is not only the 48-hour clock. It is not only the threat to obliterate power plants. It is not only the Strait of Hormuz. What keeps me up at night is what happens when a government backs itself into a corner and then discovers that every available exit is more dangerous than the situation it started from. That is where I think the United States is now. And the reason I say that is very simple. The ultimatum was not constructed as a strategic instrument. It was constructed as a political display of will. The moment it was posted, America inherited a problem that had no clean resolution. That is the core logic of the reference document. And I think it is exactly right. People hear an ultimatum and imagine strength. They hear a deadline and imagine control. They hear public threats and imagine leverage. But in real statecraft, those things are only useful if the objective is clearly defined, compliance is measurable, the enforcement mechanism is sustainable, the retaliation risk is acceptable, allies are aligned, and the political leadership can still move in more than one direction without collapsing into humiliation or disaster here. Almost none of those conditions exist. So what do we actually have? We have a war already moving through its fourth week without full congressional authorization. We have a conflict that began after diplomacy was still in motion and then expanded rapidly through Operation Epic Fury. We have Hormuz closed, a fifth of the world, oil flow disrupted, prices rising, casualties mounting, and a region already full of vulnerable infrastructure. We have an administration that said the war was winding down and then within a day threatened a far wider escalation. And now we have a public countdown that leaves Washington trapped between escalation, embarrassment, and strategic decay. That is not command. That is entrapment of your own making. I want to walk through this slowly because when people panic, they often mistake motion for clarity. And clarity is exactly what is missing. The President's message demanded that Iran fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz without threat inside 48 hours. Otherwise, the United States would begin striking power plants, starting with the largest one. It sounds blunt, it sounds decisive, it sounds forceful. But the moment you take it seriously as policy instead of performance, it begins to unravel. What does fully reopen without threat mean in real operational terms? Does it mean every mine is removed? Does it mean every Iranian position is neutralized? Does it mean commercial traffic resumes at normal pace? Does it mean insurance markets calm down? Does it mean the United States certifies the route safe enough for Western shipping? None of that is obvious. And that matters because if compliance cannot be clearly measured, then the ultimatum is not a road to settlement. It is a stage prop that allows the issuer to decide after the fact whether the target passed or failed. That is the first trap. The second trap is even more dangerous. The punishment threatened is not a narrow battlefield adjustment. It is a strike set against critical civilian power infrastructure in a country of roughly 90 million people, hospitals, water systems, refrigeration, homes, basic civilian life. Whatever legal language people want to hide behind, everyone knows what that means in practice. Darkness does not fall on military headquarters alone. It falls on families. It falls on patients. It falls on children. It falls on people who had no say in this war and no capacity to alter its direction. So now the administration has attached its credibility to a threat whose execution could produce a humanitarian disaster and a broader regional response. That is the second trap. The third trap comes from retaliation. Iran has already signaled that attacks on its grid would invite retaliation against energy and desalination infrastructure across the Gulf. Think carefully about what that means. It means the UAE, Kuwait, Saudi facilities. It means places where American personnel are present. It means the wider energy system that underpins transport, industry, inflation expectations, and daily life far beyond the battlefield. It means the crisis does not remain inside the frame of the original post. And once retaliation expands horizontally like that, the story is no longer about forcing one concession at one choke point. It becomes a rolling regional emergency. That is the third trap. The fourth trap is credibility. A lot of people say that if you issue the threat and then do not act, American credibility suffers. There is truth in that. But the mistake is imagining that credibility only breaks when you fail to pull the trigger. Credibility also breaks when you issue threats that reveal poor planning, vague benchmarks, weak coalition preparation, and no realistic path to stable success. In other words, an empty threat is damaging, but a reckless threat can be just as damaging because it teaches the world that American signaling is shaped by improvisation rather than coherent statecraft. That is why I say all roads here are bad. Let me lay them out. Scenario one, Iran partially complies, some shipping resumes, conditions remain unstable. The administration claims progress and tries to move on, but the mines are still there, the conflict remains unauthorized, and the structure of the crisis remains intact. You have delayed the reckoning, not solved it. Scenario 2, Iran does not comply and the United States follows through. Now the war moves into a new phase. Civilian systems go dark, Gulf infrastructure comes under retaliatory threat, oil prices surge harder, allies panic, markets shudder. The regional war everyone said they did not want begins to look less like a warning and more like a timetable. Scenario 3, the deadline passes and the United States does not strike. In that case, every ally and adversary starts recalculating American resolve, but they do so through a lens already clouded by erratic signaling. Some conclude the threat was theater. Others conclude Washington is divided. Others conclude the president is volatile but bounded by institutions he publicly ignores. None of those readings strengthens deterrence in a durable way. That is why I keep saying the ultimatum boxed America in every branch leaves the country worse off than before the post was written. That is the true scandal here. Not simply that the language was reckless, not simply that the target class was morally dangerous, but that a self-inflicted rhetorical box has replaced a strategy. Now let me widen the frame. This did not happen in a vacuum. The conflict itself grew out of a chain of earlier decisions. Diplomacy in Geneva was still alive. Then came the strikes. Then came the closure of Hormuz. Then came rising gas prices, mounting civilian casualties, and retaliation against Israel. Then came the claim that the war was nearing its objectives. Then immediately after that, the ultimatum. That sequence matters because it reveals a political logic that is now overpowering strategic logic. Once leaders begin speaking in public absolutes, every adjustment becomes politically costly. To moderate is to appear weak, to delay is to appear confused, to negotiate is to appear cornered, so the temptation becomes obvious. Keep escalating the language and hope that somehow reality bends around it. But reality does not care about branding. Reality is mines in the water. Reality is vulnerable power grids. Reality is allies who depend on that shipping lane and were not seriously consulted. Reality is a Congress that failed to assert itself. Reality is families paying more at the pump. Reality is military personnel exposed to retaliatory consequences from decisions made far above them. Reality is that war punishes confusion, and this ultimatum is soaked in confusion. Even within the official American picture, there is a visible disconnect. Commanders were already describing Iran's ability to target shipping as degraded. If that is true, then why the panic countdown? If it is not true, then why was the public told the situation was improving? Either way, the gap between battlefield assessment and political messaging becomes another source of risk that matters, because wars are not only fought with missiles, they are fought with perception, coalition, confidence, market expectations, and the credibility of command. When those things split apart, bad decisions multiply, and that split is visible everywhere. Congress has not supplied democratic legitimacy. Allies have not been treated like full partners in the decision chain. The legal framework has not been persuasively laid out to the public. The humanitarian implications have not been honestly confronted. The economic costs are being pushed downward onto people with the least capacity to absorb them. This is what a trap looks like in a democracy. It is not always a tank column crossing a border. Sometimes it is a political system creating incentives that reward public maximalism and punish disciplined retreat. That is exactly what social media ultimatums do in wartime. They convert strategic flexibility into ego exposure. And once that happens, the whole country inherits the danger. The family in Ohio buying gas did not ask for this. The service member on a base in the Gulf did not ask for this. The allied government whose energy system depends on Hormuz did not ask to be informed by telephone screen. After the fact, even many of the voters cheering tough language do not actually understand what the follow-through would mean once water systems, hospitals, desalination networks, global shipping insurance, and retaliation cycles are factored in. That is why serious leadership exists in the first place, to think past the emotional reward of sounding tough. The reference document ends in a place I think is very important. It insists that all three possible outcomes leave America worse off because the ultimatum was a political instrument, not a strategic one. I agree, and think the lesson goes even further when leaders have been using national power to solve their own rhetorical problems. The nation itself becomes collateral. That is what this is. A leader said the war was winding down. Then he issued a threat that made de-escalation look weak. Now, the state must either absorb humiliation, absorb escalation, or absorb a prolonged credibility crisis. That is not leverage. That is the state paying the bill for one man's need to look decisive in public. A republic should never accept that as normal. So what is the way out? First, stop pretending that more dramatic language is a substitute for strategic coherence. It is not. Second, force a public accounting. Congress should debate authorization, objectives, proportionality, civilian protection, allied posture. and end state in the open. Third, reopen real diplomatic channels, because even partial off-ramps are preferable to a spiral built around personal deadlines. Fourth, restore consultation with allies whose security and economies are already tied to the consequences of this war. And finally, speak honestly to the public. Tell them there is no magic option. Tell them force has costs. Tell them deterrence without discipline becomes recklessness. Tell them that strong countries do not create traps for themselves just to feel strong for one news cycle. I still believe the United States can get off this road, but not by pretending the ultimatum was clever, not by pretending the choices are better than they are, not by pretending that if you shout loudly enough, law, logistics, civilian vulnerability, and alliance politics will simply disappear. The most dangerous phrase in this whole crisis may be the simplest one, 48 hours, because once a country starts governing war through clocks, posts, and public ego, time itself becomes an enemy. And if we do not break out of that logic soon, the clock will not just run down on the ultimatum, it will run down an American room for error. And there is far less of that left than people want to admit.